The most heartwarming show on TV was The Repair Business, where shattered antiques and their stories were revived. But what if beneath those lovely smiles and soothing tones came a story of tragedy, solitude, and silent disintegration nobody saw coming? This awful secret changed many lives. Though quiet, it changed the show forever. It helped the repair shop emotionally collapse. What happened behind those barn doors? Not good. You'll know why after this video. This barn fixed the broken. The repair shop didn't seem like a cultural movement starting show. There were no flashing lights, dramatic music, or contrived conflicts. Instead, it delivered something modern television had quietly lost: genuine human connection. A team of experienced craftsmen worked quietly in a Sussex barn, using antique tools and natural light to restore shattered relics. Everything has a story, about itself and the people tied to it. A child's bedtime music box, an old grandfather's kitchen clock, teddy bear knitted by a deceased father. Not just repairs. Emotional archaeology revealed memory, trauma, love, and legacy. This may have been the show's secret success. It didn't pretend life was perfect or damage was shameful. It emphasized the idea that things and people can be worn, scarred, or broken, yet nonetheless beautiful. That spirit gave the barn a unique energy as a studio and shelter. Both guests and specialists sobbed. Space felt holy. A weight was hidden underneath that warmth. Emotional restoration goes beyond the tableware. Holding someone else's grief long enough helps them let go. You become tired of doing that every day in front of cameras. The crowd appreciated the show's soul, but they didn't realize that it came from people who sacrificed more than they had to. Few had as much subtle emotional weight as Susie Fletcher, whose narrative would show that even healers need healing. Susie Fletcher arrives quietly. Susie Fletcher debuted on The Repair Shop in 2018 without much excitement. She entered the barn, took out her leather tools, and worked. Her stability and calmness made her seem like she'd always been there, even though we'd just met her. Most viewers didn't know, and couldn't know, that her presence was the result of a silently devastated existence. Susie had returned to the UK after years abroad. Her spouse Rob died of pancreatic cancer. That alone can ruin a life. Susie didn't merely mourn when she returned home. It was about rebuilding from something much more difficult than anyone could perceive. She resisted camera time. She was emotionally exhausted, not shy. Television was her final thought. She wanted no crowd. She desired peace, routine, and possibly invisibility. Steve Fletcher, her brother and a show fan, supported her. He saw something she didn't see in herself, and she joined. It was quiet, like putting your toe into new water after a storm. She was ideal as a saddler and leather expert. A tactile, rhythmic, and quietly demanding work. She had a focus, not distracting, but grounded. She didn't need to explain or overshare. The tools spoke for her. Her work was a nonverbal interaction. Her honesty struck viewers immediately. She was the calm in the storm, listening more than she spoke and treating every repair with regard. The result was more than professional grace. Survival was personal, building something of her own piece by piece. Susie wasn't only returning to the UK, though she rarely mentioned it. She reclaimed herself. The Secret Saddler. Despite becoming more popular as the seasons went on, Susie Fletcher remained private. Her warmth and concern were obvious, but her personal life, unlike many famous individuals, was kept private. Her mystery wasn't intentional. She carried herself with quiet dignity. Behind that tenderness was a haunting narrative no one knew. Susie finally spoke up about her marriage in 2023, including her husband's cancer diagnosis and years of intimate violence she had hidden. She said her husband, Rob, was mentally unstable and physically abusive in interviews and her memoir. She vividly remembered being choked so brutally that she thought her life was finished. She survived psychologically for 15 years. The man she loved had demons, childhood trauma that never healed. Pain eventually spread. Susie, like many survivors, kept quiet. Not out of denial, but because silence feels safer than exposing after you're in it for so long. Learn to adapt, manage, and survive. The 2013 death of her husband was complicated. Grief and release coexisted. After an abusive relationship, guilt typically follows. You mourn whom? The person they were, or the one you wished for. Now things get more poignant. Susie joined the repair business without processing this trauma. A compartment existed. She hid it in an old suitcase, but not out of mind. Her decade-later disclosure wasn't only catharsis, a revelation. For viewers who had seen her soothe others, the truth was shocking. She had silently broken herself while healing others. Despite its healing power, the barn was only half of her recovery. There was still much to tell. Healing on camera, hurting off. A paradox exists in shows like The Repair Shop. In this lovely in-between area, not quite documentary or fiction, real individuals recollect emotional events under camera lights. Susie Fletcher found that setup both beneficial and burdensome. She was calm on camera, the kind of person you'd trust with something fragile. Whether a century-old saddle or childhood memories, however, viewers didn't realize that the show's emotional openness often matched her own buried sadness. Susie's barn job was more than a job. It let her focus her pain into something helpful and therapeutic. Repetition, measured stitching, and worn leather under her hands helped her regulate her emotions. Routine can be oxygen for trauma survivors. The other side existed. Guest eyes were wide with hope, hands trembling as they passed over family artifacts. They cried, laughed, and shared grief and survival stories. Graceful Susie listened. Sometimes she nodded quietly. Other times she spoke gently. She usually absorbed their feelings like a sponge, exhibiting empathy without sharing her tale. Colleagues praised her strength. Despite his jokes about his crush on her, Richard Biggs recognized her deeply. Susie was carrying more than expected. She anchored the barn quietly. She helped everyone without expecting anything in return. However, the body notices emotional effort, especially invisible labor. Adds up. Even the most tough people eventually notice their limitations. Susie repaired things on camera. However, off camera, she was slowly realizing that she might need to start healing herself. Mask-slipping moment. Saying something after being quiet is powerful. Susie Fletcher hid her history for years. Seal, not hide in shame. Like closing a painful box. She did what many survivors do. She lived for power, usefulness, and busyness. Her technique worked successfully at the repair shop. Even the strongest scaffolding eventually breaks. Susie published her memoir, The Sun Over the Mountains, in 2023. Title alone felt like a message. The story was about returning to light after darkness. What followed was more than a recount. It was quiet defiance and reclamation. She described her terror, bewilderment, and years of unremitting fear. "I honestly believed I was going to die," she said of the choking incident. The gently uttered phrase hit like a thunderclap. Many people were surprised to learn how much she had undergone while appearing serene and nice. This was her life's chapter without shock value. About closure. Writing the book was her way of repairing herself with truth, not leather or thread. She subsequently called writing cathartic, a relief she didn't realize she needed until the words flowed. What it redefined makes this chapter of her narrative so significant. Even old episodes looked different. She held back tears as she listened to a guest's narrative, keeping her words silent. She was more than empathic, viewers realized. It was a deep connection, quiet and cozy. The mask didn't break instantly. It had slid slowly, in her own time. She didn't lose her image when it did. The depth, weight, and reality of it increased. However, emotional honesty spreads. After her story was published, her barn equilibrium changed. Barn's emotional toll. The repair shop was never just a TV. The workplace was a living emotional ecology for employees. You can forget that while the cameras rolled, the music swelled, and the editors tied everything up with an optimistic bow, the barn's residents were absorbing a huge emotional weight. Every item brought to the session was layered with memories, longing, and pain. A family-inherited hand-carved toy, shattered clock that ticked through married years, faded portrait in music box. These were memory vessels, not just objects. Loss sufferers know that memories may weigh heavier than stone. Susie and the ensemble didn't just restore these artifacts, they held emotional space for the people who brought them in. To hear someone explain their mother's last days or a child's voice tremble when talking about a late grandfather, then stitch through that emotion with quiet hands on your workstation. That's emotional labor, not a talent, and often unseen. Long days of filming. Some set guests cried. Experts did. Occasionally, production interrupted due to intense emotions in the room. Even the strongest, most stoic professionals had their limit, but the barn's silence didn't allow emotional release. Work has to continue. Susie carried more than most. Many ways, she was the team's emotional anchor. Her silence was potential, not emptiness. She welcomed others' tales. They felt safe with her. Who holds space for you when you're always holding space for others? That silent query came up in tiredness, burnout, and quiet withdrawal, not breakdowns or outbursts. The spectacle appeared unchanged, but within the barn, emotional exhaustion was growing. A louder interruption hit the repair business just as that emotional weight was getting heavier. Jay Blades fell during the storm. Jay Blades was unbeatable until 2024. He was the repair shop's face, guide, and pleasant companion who welcomed guests and connected each story. His viewers trusted him. He was seen as an emotional interpreter who could speak for professionals and guests and bridge craftsmanship and connection. The headlines followed. Details were initially unclear, then became clear. The show's tone changed when Jay was charged, with details still emerging. BBC answered quickly. Episodes were withdrawn, tours were postponed, and public faith waned. This went beyond legal issues. The show's symbolic foundation collapsed. Jay was more than a host. He spoke for the barn, standing in the doorway and telling us every object had a story week after week. When controversy replaced sincerity in his account, the audience felt betrayed, not just of trust, but of tone. The repair shop's soft-spoken, emotionally rich world was suddenly shadowed. Susie, already emotionally weak, took this as more than just poor press. It destabilized. Her shelter was the barn, a constant source of stability. Now even it was vulnerable. Insiders said morale and momentum dropped. A show previously known for emotional openness was now mired in quiet, suspicion, and discomfort. Already visible fissures widened. The scandal wasn't the most telling portion. How the show reacted. The BBC minimized, delayed, and avoided direct reaction. Jay wasn't alone in retreat. It was clear. It was truth. Both have characterized the barn for years. Whether anyone admitted it or not, the storm had arrived and caused damage. The workshop has cracks. The repair shop survived as the headlines faded and the public moved on to the next big topic. There were no cancellations or episode goodbyes. A quieter, subtler event occurred. The show waned. Tour dates that sold out in minutes were postponed or downsized. Fans noticed that Susie Fletcher and other popular faces on promotional posters weren't appearing. Social media activity decreased. Fan comments asked the same question: where's everyone? The actual change was enthusiasm, not attendance. The barn felt odd. Something intangible was lost. That feeling of emotional warmth and comfort. It was less noticeable. The viewers sensed it, even if they couldn't express it. Internal sources reported tiredness. Once a strength, the show's emotional intensity was now a slow-burning problem. Experts wore down. Stories were merging. Though simple, the formula felt strained. Susie was the biggest missing piece. No one had seen her leave. There was no goodbye. But she left. That silence spoke louder than any controversy. She was the quiet, stable emotional center. Without her, something changed. It was like eliminating a pendulum weight. The balance was wrong. The BBC tried to pretend. The barn remained. The lights remained. However, it became more like a museum of the show's past rather than a living, breathing space of connection. But an imitation. This happened without anyone uttering a word. However, the stillness was telling. Susie departs. Not a headline.